Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. September 8th, 2021. Gulf Breeze, Florida, a quiet residential block where retirees walk dogs at sunset, kids leave bikes on lawns, and most nights end in silence. But at 6:22 p.m. that evening, a call came into Santa Rosa County Dispatch from a man inside his own home. He said he was locked in the garage. He said his wife had a gun. And then calmly but urgently, he said, "She just shot me." What followed were four distinct gunshots. Sharp, close, and then total silence. Within minutes, law enforcement units arrived at the property on Columbus Drive. They found the garage door shut. Inside, on the concrete floor, lay the body of Colin James Turner, 34 years old, former U.S. Marine. He had sustained four gunshot wounds to the back. His cell phone was near his body, still connected to 911. No signs of a struggle, no signs of life. On the porch sat Brienne Kristen Kuhn Turner, 37 years old, U.S. Navy Chief Petty Officer. She was not crying. She was not panicked. Her service pistol lay to her right. Her hands were resting on her thighs. When approached, she stated clearly, "I shot him. He tried to choke me." She was taken into custody at 6:39 p.m. without incident. Inside the residence, officers noted the living room lights were on, the kitchen counter had an open pack of juice boxes, and two child-sized backpacks hung by the door. A normal home on the surface, but the silence pressed hard. The children were not present during the shooting. Later reports confirmed that they were with a relative in Pensacola that day, but this wasn't the first time authorities had been called to the Turner residence. It was the third call to 911 in under 12 hours, and only the third had resulted in a fatality. Earlier that morning at 9:44 a.m., officers responded to a domestic disturbance. Brienne reported Colin had been intimidating during a dispute over parenting time. There were no injuries, no weapons mentioned, no arrest. By 1:28 p.m., another call, this time from Colin. He told dispatch that Brienne had been erratic, verbally aggressive, and that he was concerned for the children. Again, no injuries. Again, no arrest. That third call was different. It was not a plea for intervention. It was a final statement. When investigators entered the garage, they found no blood splatter beyond the area of impact. The wounds were to the upper and mid-back. Medical examiner records would later confirm that Colin was facing away from his wife when shot. The trajectory was downward, suggesting he was either bent over or crouched. The distance was close range, approximately 3 to 5 feet. No defensive wounds. No evidence of a physical altercation. No DNA under the fingernails. No bruising consistent with the choking she claimed. Her own skin was free of injuries. The forensic profile within hours began to deviate sharply from the version she gave at the scene. The weapon used was a Glock 43, a compact 9mm semi-automatic pistol, standard issue for many in the Navy. Registered to Brienne, recently cleaned, recently loaded. The trigger pull was light, intentional. A ballistics tech on site noted, "No misfires, no hesitation. Whoever fired this knew the weapon." Investigators interviewed neighbors. No one reported hearing yelling, no loud arguments, just four shots, rapid, evenly spaced, and then the sound of a car alarm that had triggered from the gunfire vibrations. The home itself was orderly, nothing overturned, no sign of struggle in the hallway or kitchen, no overturned chairs, no broken picture frames. If there was a fight, it had not left a trace. They did find one thing, a handwritten note on the fridge, scrawled in marker, "Pick up from school Friday," a mundane reminder. But it gave the scene an eerie normalcy. This wasn't a place where anyone expected a fatal shooting. Not that day, not like that. By the time Brienne was booked, she had already invoked her right to an attorney. She made no further statements. The body of Colin Turner was transported to the medical examiner's office in Pensacola at 8:43 p.m. Initial autopsy confirmed no alcohol or drugs in his system. The bullet wounds were precise. All four entered from behind. Two penetrated the lung, one struck the lower spine, one grazed the scapula. Time of death was declared at 6:25 p.m., 3 minutes after the 911 call had begun. Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office classified the incident as a suspected domestic homicide. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, was informed due to the shooter's military status, but jurisdiction remained local. The question wasn't only why it happened, it was how so many warnings, calls, concerns, silent breakdowns led to this. At that moment, they didn't know whether this was a tragic escalation or a premeditated act hiding behind a claim of fear. But they knew one thing for certain. Someone had pulled the trigger 4 times, and the man on the floor had never fired a single shot. Colin James Turner wasn't supposed to end up in a garage calling 911. On paper, his profile was everything you expect from a stable American life. A decorated veteran, father of 3, employed, no prior criminal history. But paper rarely shows what's just beneath the surface. Colin had served in the U.S. Marine Corps, 2 tours overseas, and earned an honorable discharge before transitioning to civilian security contracting. He had no known psychological diagnoses. Toxicology would later confirm he wasn't under the influence. His military record described him as reliable, resilient, and responsive under stress. In 2019, he married Brienne Kuhn, a U.S. Navy officer stationed out of Naval Air Station Pensacola. Both came from structured systems. Both lived by discipline. The first 2 years showed no reported domestic disturbances. The 3rd year cracked. On April 12, 2021, Colin contacted a family law attorney in Escambia County to inquire about modifying custody rights. He indicated concerns about mental instability, but made no formal accusations. The file remained inactive. 3 weeks later, a private counselor's intake form submitted by Colin suggested increasing tension over parenting decisions. He wrote, "My wife's behavior changes fast. Sometimes I come home and everything's locked. She won't speak." The counseling was never scheduled. No follow-up, no escalation. But the patterns were there. Cell phone extraction reports later retrieved from Colin's personal device showed a spike in search queries for terms such as how to document emotional abuse, custody rights for military spouse, and restraining order requirements in Florida. These searches were recorded between July and early September 2021. There was no record of him ever contacting law enforcement directly until the day he died. Investigators then pulled call logs and text exchanges between the couple from August 1st to September 7th. What emerged was a dynamic best described as cold control. No explicit threats, no vulgarity, but repeated instances where Brienne issued instructions rather than discussion, where deviation from her plan triggered isolation. In one string of messages, do not alter pickup times. If you change anything, you lose visitation next week. I am reporting your instability to command. Each message was time-stamped. The tone remained consistent. There was no name-calling, but there was no softness either. When agents reviewed the security logs from the family home's doorbell app, they noted multiple short-duration recordings marked activity at front door during the last 2 weeks of Colin's life. Most lasted fewer than 10 seconds. No audio was retrievable. The microphone function had been disabled in early August. That change was never reported by either party. What did surface was a single clip from September 3rd, 5:17 p.m. It showed Colin standing on the front porch, knocking. He held a small duffel bag. The door did not open. After roughly 90 seconds, he sat on the front steps. 5 minutes passed. Then the recording ended. From a procedural standpoint, there was nothing to act on. No restraining order had been filed, no charges, no third-party reports. But the silence between systems was growing louder. Military records confirmed that both Brienne and Colin had taken the required family readiness training during active duty. Both knew the escalation protocols. Both knew the threshold for what legally counted as threat. Neither pulled that lever. Detectives brought in forensic behavioral analysts to reconstruct communication habits. One noted in the report, "There is an emotional attrition at play here. Not explosive conflict, but attritional erosion. These dynamics don't create bruises. They create helplessness." On September 6th, 2 days before the shooting, Colin sent a text to a longtime friend in Tallahassee. It read, "If something ever happens to me, look at my phone. Don't believe the first version." The friend never responded. The message remained unread until after death. Brienne's digital history, pulled via warrant post arrest, showed an entirely different focus. She'd searched legal databases for self-defense law in Florida, castle doctrine spouse, and documenting threats without witness. Those searches occurred between September 4th and September 7th. 14 unique searches, 9 of them within a 1-hour window the night before Colin's death. By then, the couple had already experienced multiple confrontations over school pickups, housing transfers, and who could legally relocate the children. No restraining order had been filed, no therapist had intervened, no family member had called police, but digital indicators were flashing red. In towns like Gulf Breeze, conflicts rarely draw attention until sirens show up. And by that time, the worst has already happened. There were no security cameras inside the garage. No neighbors saw the incident. But everything leading up to the final moment left a trail, data, texts, unspoken patterns, evidence that, when pulled together, painted a different picture than what was claimed at the scene. Sometimes in cases like this, the forensic problem isn't what's missing. It's how clearly the data lines up. Too clean, too quiet. As one lead investigator wrote in his report, it didn't feel like a spontaneous break. It felt like a pressure release, planned and executed. The Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office first logged the Turner address at 9:44 a.m. on September 8, 2021. The call came in from Brienne Turner. She reported a verbal argument with her husband over school logistics. No mention of violence, no mention of weapons. Just an escalating disagreement. She said she couldn't de-escalate herself. A deputy was dispatched and arrived within 20 minutes. The interaction, captured on body-worn camera, lasted less than 14 minutes. According to the deputy's report, both parties were calm, separated in different parts of the house. No visible injuries, no shouting during the visit. The deputy classified it as a low-level domestic disturbance, verbal only. No crime had occurred. No one was removed from the property. The second call came at 1:28 p.m. This time, Colin Turner made the report. He told dispatch that Brienne had locked herself in the master bedroom after throwing a plate at the wall. He stated no one had been struck and that the children weren't home, but he was concerned it might escalate. The responding officer noted tension upon arrival, but again, no physical contact or threats were alleged. Brienne declined to speak further and stated she wanted peace and space. Colin reiterated that he didn't want to press charges, just that he needed the record on file. The officer documented the incident and left the residence. 2 calls, 0 detainments, both logged as civil matters with no probable cause for arrest. Then came the third call, the fatal one. It originated from Colin's cell at 6:22 p.m. He was in the garage. Dispatch audio confirms he stated he had been locked in by his wife and that she had a firearm. Less than 40 seconds into the call, the dispatcher heard the first gunshot. "She just shot me," were the last words recorded. 3 more gunshots followed, spaced within 6 seconds. Body cam footage from the responding unit, arriving at 6:26 p.m., shows officers approaching the front of the Turner home with weapons drawn. The footage is clear. The garage remains shut. Brienne was on the front steps, arms placed on her knees, firearm to her right. She did not attempt to flee or resist. When commanded to lie face down, she complied. The gun was secured and bagged. Her hands were clean. No blood, no visible injury. Officers entered the garage through the side door and discovered Colin lying face down near the interior wall. No pulse. 4 visible gunshot wounds to the back. A cell phone lay under his outstretched hand, screen cracked. The 911 line was still open. No shell casings were found scattered. All 4 were in a tight radius, recovered within 2 feet of each other. The grouping suggested the shooter stood still during discharge. The muzzle-to-body distance was under 5 feet. Ballistics would later confirm all rounds were fired from the same registered Glock 43, a weapon legally owned by Brienne and maintained to service standards. Deputies secured the scene and called in the Major Crimes Unit by 6:50 p.m. Forensic investigators performed initial sweeps and preserved the integrity of all known physical evidence. The home was well kept. No signs of forced entry, no blood spatter outside the immediate point of impact, no physical disturbance in the kitchen, hallway, or master bedroom, no furniture knocked over, no struggle evident. The garage floor showed no signs of movement or disruption. A folding chair was propped against the wall, unused. A duffel bag with Collins' gym gear was on the floor, zipped. Everything was static, still, clean. A neighbor across the street told investigators they heard 4 pops like firecrackers, but didn't think to call it in. Another resident, 2 doors down, recalled seeing Brienne sitting outside, like she was waiting for someone to arrive. The responding detective noted a recurring issue. Multiple calls in a single day that all fell short of criminal threshold, until the threshold was crossed with a firearm. No mandatory arrest laws applied due to lack of evidence of assault during the earlier visits. Florida statutes allow officer discretion unless clear signs of imminent threat or injury are present. The reality of domestic case response in real time is this: unless someone's bleeding, screaming, or fleeing, there's usually no arrest. The problem is, when those things finally happen, it's already too late. Inside Brienne's wallet was a folded piece of paper containing an unsigned note, handwritten. The note read, "If anything happens, this wasn't my fault. I warned him." Investigators weren't sure if it had been written before the shooting or after. There were no fingerprints on it except hers. 3 calls in one day, 2 logged, 1 fatal. The question was no longer what happened, but why didn't it stop sooner? The framework was there. Trained professionals responded, documented, checked the boxes. But no intervention took place. In some towns, tragedies come like storms. Sudden, loud. But in this case, it came as procedure. 3 times in plain sight. At 8:15 p.m. on September 8, 2021, the medical examiner's van pulled away from the Turner residence. Inside was the body of Colin James Turner, 34 years old, 4 gunshot wounds to the back. The initial assessment from the scene was clear. No shots fired by the victim, no struggle evident, and no movement from the shooter after the first round. The forensic team began reconstruction immediately. The scene was stable. The garage, sealed from the inside, was a confined space measuring just under 18 by 20 feet. Colin's body was located 4 feet from the side wall, positioned face down, with no signs of drag or shift. The blood pool was compact. Trajectory lasers revealed all 4 bullets entered at downward angles, each ranging between 27 and 36 degrees, suggesting that the shooter had a height advantage or that the victim was either crouched or kneeling. No casings were found outside the firing zone. All 4 9mm shell casings were recovered within a 30-inch cluster, indicating the shooter remained stationary during discharge. There were no ricochets, no errant marks, clean angles, precise. The garage lighting was functional. No evidence of power outage or bulb failure. Colin's phone screen was lit and cracked, time-stamped from the 911 call. He'd been dialing with his right hand. The device was recovered 2 feet from his head, lying face up. Gunshot residue tests returned positive on the shooter's dominant hand, consistent with recent firing. There was no transfer on Colin's clothing and no residue on his hands, confirming he had not discharged a firearm. The Glock 43 found at the scene was registered, chambered, and cleaned within the previous 48 hours. Safety off, no jam, no malfunction. Autopsy confirmed what trajectory suggested. The bullets entered through the upper back and exited near the front rib cage, 2 piercing the lung, 1 lodging near the spinal column. No contact wounds, no stippling. Estimated firing distance, 3 to 5 feet. There were no bruises, scratches, or cuts on either party, save for abrasions sustained during Brienne's handcuffing. Colin had no defensive wounds, no bruising around the neck, despite the suspect's verbal claim of attempted strangulation. No pressure damage to the hyoid bone. The forensic pathologist included a single sentence in his summary. Findings do not support close-range altercation. Floor friction readings showed no recent movement around the body. Dust patterns under Colin's boots indicated he stood in place before collapsing forward. Tire marks on the garage floor from a parked SUV were dry and undisturbed. No vehicle had moved through the scene before or during the incident. Detectives diagrammed the garage layout. From the victim's position, the only available exit, the side door, was blocked, locked from the outside. The shooter's line of fire traced directly from the main interior door to the point of impact. That door had been opened after the shooting, not before. All physical evidence suggested the victim was confined and facing away at the time the first round was fired. By 11:03 p.m., investigators concluded their primary reconstruction. They did not classify the shooting as accidental. They did not label it reactive. The report focused on alignment, spacing, and position. The case wasn't being built on interpretation. It was being built on data. In forensic work, trajectory is among the least ambiguous variables. Unlike memory, it doesn't change under pressure. Unlike motive, it doesn't require guesswork. Bullets go where they're directed. And in this case, they all went in the same direction, into a man who never saw them coming. The first formal statement was recorded on the night of the incident, inside a small interview room at the Santa Rosa County Sheriff's Office. The suspect had invoked counsel immediately following her arrest, but she agreed to provide a brief version of events with her attorney present. The session lasted just under 26 minutes. It was the only time she voluntarily spoke before trial. She stated that her husband had been escalating all day, that she feared for her safety, that she had locked herself in the bedroom, but he wouldn't leave her alone. She said she retrieved her firearm only after feeling cornered. According to her, she opened the garage door because she believed he had calmed down, but when he allegedly advanced toward her, she fired. Investigators documented the claim in full, then compared it against the existing forensic timeline. The door leading into the garage showed no prints from the inside, no forced pressure marks, no DNA from the victim. The handle was wiped clean. There was no evidence it had been opened prior to discharge, no scuffing around the frame, no transferred dust from the victim's clothing along the lower third of the door, which would have indicated contact or impact. The theory that she opened the door, stepped in, and fired under duress was physically unsupported. Her account also suggested a face-to-face encounter, but 4 shots had entered the victim's back. No hesitation pattern, all aligned within a consistent vertical path. Investigators then turned to her phone. Search history revealed queries consistent with pre-incident planning. Castle Doctrine Florida spouse, stand your ground garage shooting, how close does threat need to be, all searched in the 48 hours prior. Her attorney argued that the searches reflected concern, not preparation, but the pattern matched a different narrative, an anticipation of needing legal protection, not fear in the moment. No calls had been made to military support services, no messages sent to supervisors or family, no digital communication documented any warning or cry for help. In cases where fear drives reaction, there's often a record of attempts to de-escalate or ask for assistance. Here there was none. Forensic linguists were brought in to analyze her phrasing during the interview. Their report noted an unusually structured response, more aligned with legal framing than emotional recollection. Terms like "I feared for my life" and "I was in immediate danger" are common in self-defense cases. But when repeated verbatim, without descriptive detail or deviation, they often suggest rehearsal. That doesn't prove guilt, but it widens the gap between trauma and testimony. Detectives noted that the timeline of her actions after the shooting was also highly controlled. She placed the firearm on the front step, sat still, waited for police, did not flee, did not call for medical help. A behavioral analyst summarized her posture as composed, not reactive. This isn't a matter of personality. It's a matter of behavioral consistency. Her version of events portrayed panic, but nothing in her actions matched that state. That conflict between claim and conduct became central to the prosecution's theory of intent. Cases like this remind us that truth doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's in the quiet disconnect between what's said and what can be proven. And the human cost of those gaps, especially in domestic settings, rarely ends at the crime scene. By early 2024, over 2 years had passed since the fatal shooting of Colin Turner. The prosecution had compiled a case built almost entirely on forensic evidence, digital trails, and procedural inconsistencies. There were no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage inside the garage, and no recorded confession. But the lack of direct footage didn't weaken the case. In fact, it clarified it. The absence of struggle, the absence of urgency, and the presence of deliberate steps, each told a version of intent louder than any video could. The prosecution's strategy hinged on one principle. This wasn't a crime of passion, It was a preemptive strike wrapped in the language of self-defense, and they would prove it by sequencing three types of evidence: digital behavior, shooting mechanics, and timeline contradictions. The digital forensics unit reconstructed 2 months of search history and deleted messages from the defendant's device. While none contained overt threats or confessions, patterns emerged. Repetitive late-night searches related to Florida's self-defense statutes, variations of how to file claims against spouse, and an inquiry made just 48 hours before the shooting: how to document a domestic altercation if there are no witnesses. The data showed no similar searches in the months before. It was clustered, condensed around a time when other behavior was also changing. Cell records also placed her phone at the residence during all three 911 calls made on September 8th. There was no sign she attempted to leave the house, no communication with military supervisors, no outreach to law enforcement prior to the final incident. In court, the state called in a firearms specialist from FDLE to reconstruct shot sequencing. He testified that the 4 rounds were not fired in a panic, but in a rhythm consistent with controlled breathing and steady trigger pull. The slide cycle of a Glock 43 makes rapid firing possible, but not without movement or variation. There was none. Bullet spacing on the victim's body aligned cleanly along a vertical path. No horizontal spread. That pattern was not consistent with a struggle. It was consistent with fixed position targeting. Her defense had initially filed a stand your ground motion, invoking Florida's right to meet perceived threat with deadly force. But the motion was denied. The judge ruled that the physical evidence failed to meet the basic threshold of threat or confrontation. That decision changed the direction of the trial. The defense pivoted to mental state. They introduced a new theory. The defendant suffered from residual trauma as a service member and reacted under perceived fear, not logic. The court allowed expert testimony from a Navy-appointed psychologist, but the impact was limited. There were no military evaluations prior to the incident noting instability, no record of diagnosed PTSD, no medical leave. The absence of documentation weakened the defense's pivot. Meanwhile, the prosecution introduced a final layer of evidence: video footage from the booking room. It showed the defendant sitting upright, hands on the table, silent for nearly 8 minutes before asking a deputy if her children had been taken by the state. Her tone was calm, her face dry. That moment didn't prove guilt, but it contributed to a prosecution argument that her post-incident behavior was less about panic and more about preparation. Jurors were not told what to feel. They were asked to consider what could be shown, and everything that could be shown added up. Intent isn't always spoken. It's sometimes built, step by step, inside search bars, browser windows, and behavior that only looks neutral when isolated. When examined together, the pattern speaks louder than motive ever could. Jury selection began on September 11, 2024, at the Santa Rosa County Courthouse. The defense had requested a bench trial, citing undue media attention and potential bias, but the court denied it. The judge ruled that a 12-person panel would provide a more balanced evaluation of fact versus perception. By the end of the second day, a jury was seated: 9 women, 3 men. Most were middle-aged. None had prior law enforcement or military service. That detail mattered to both sides. Opening statements were measured. The prosecution outlined a case of planned action, camouflaged by a claim of self-defense. The defense framed the defendant as a woman under mental duress, reacting to a history of intimidation. The burden was not on her to prove she was right, they said, only that she believed she had no other option. Over the next several days, the prosecution constructed its case with quiet efficiency. They led with forensic evidence, not emotion. The FDLE ballistics expert walked the jury through trajectory maps, spacing models, and the Glock 43's discharge pattern. He demonstrated that all 4 rounds were fired from a consistent position and path, each striking the victim's back at a downward angle. The consistency was emphasized as being incompatible with a physical altercation or panic firing. Next came the medical examiner. No close contact injuries, no bruising on the defendant, no abrasions, no DNA evidence suggesting a struggle. The ME concluded that Colin Turner had been standing or crouched away from the shooter at the time of the shooting. The wounds confirmed it. The angles confirmed it. Then came the digital evidence. An FDLE cybercrime specialist testified about the defendant's search history, including late-night queries on self-defense laws, custody disputes, and how to document conflict without a witness. On cross-examination, the defense argued these were common searches during stressful divorces, but the prosecution redirected, showing the clustering of search activity in the 48 hours leading to the shooting. Context, not content, was the argument. The sudden spike, combined with no documented threats or attempts to seek help, cast doubt on the defendant's fear-based claim. One key moment came when the jury was shown the booking room video. It wasn't graphic, it wasn't dramatic. It simply showed the defendant seated, waiting. Her demeanor was calm, her posture upright, no trembling hands, no shock visible. The prosecutor didn't overstate it. He simply said, "This is not a person who appears to have just survived a violent attack." The defense called one expert, a licensed Navy psychologist who had evaluated the defendant post-incident. He testified that she had symptoms consistent with hypervigilance and emotional fatigue, possibly linked to military stress. However, during cross, the state noted no formal PTSD diagnosis, no prescribed medication, no restricted duty, no prior complaints. The psychologist conceded that his opinion was limited to what the defendant self-reported after the shooting. The defense did not put the defendant on the stand. In closing, the prosecution avoided speculation. They pointed to data, the absence of any outward sign of confrontation, the trajectory analysis, and the digital pattern before the event. They reminded jurors that the victim had called 911, that he had said, "She just shot me," and that there was no dispute about who pulled the trigger. The defense emphasized context. They asked the jury to consider the weight of living under the threat of control, even if physical harm had not occurred. They asked for understanding, not technical judgment. The case was handed to the jury on the morning of September 26th. Deliberations lasted 5 hours. The verdict, guilty of first-degree murder with a firearm. Mandatory sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. No visible reaction from the defendant. She nodded, stood, and was let out by deputies. There were no television crews waiting outside, no press conference, no viral outrage. It was a quiet conviction in a quiet courtroom for a crime that had left 3 children without a father, and now, without a mother. In domestic homicide cases, the courtroom doesn't always deliver closure, but it does deliver record. A line in the ledger that says, "What happened and how it was judged." That's not always enough for the people left behind, but it is something. And for families like the Turners, something has to start somewhere. Brienne Kristen Kuhn Turner was transferred from Santa Rosa County Jail to a state correctional facility in Ocala, Florida, 3 weeks after sentencing. Her inmate designation marked her as a non-parole eligible offender, life term, first-degree murder, firearm enhancement. She would serve out the remainder of her life in custody with no prospect of appeal and no early release. For the Florida Department of Corrections, the case was closed. The database updated. The paperwork moved on. For the Turner children, there was no system to close the loop so neatly. There were 3 of them, ages ranging from 4 to 11 at the time of the shooting. 2 were biological children of both Brienne and Colin. The third was from a previous relationship and had called Colin Dad since infancy. After the conviction, the children were split into 2 guardianship arrangements. One placed with a paternal aunt in Tennessee, the other returned to the biological father of the third child, who resided in Louisiana. There was no joint reunification plan. The court-appointed guardian ad litem made the recommendation to avoid further emotional entanglement across state lines. None of the children attended the sentencing hearing. None were allowed to testify. Florida's Department of Children and Families did not issue a public statement. Internal review documents, acquired later through public records requests, confirmed that there had been no prior reports of abuse or neglect filed against either parent before September 8, 2021. The state had no legal grounds to intervene before the homicide, and afterward it could only react. That's the quiet reality in most domestic homicides. Intervention depends on visibility. And in households where both adults are high-functioning professionals, trained in systems and protocol, signs of fracture are often buried under layers of order. The sheriff's office did not face disciplinary action for its handling of the first two 911 calls on the day of the shooting. Each visit had been logged, documented, and closed per Florida law. No probable cause had been established. No one had shown visible harm. Officers followed policy, and the outcome, while tragic, fell outside the threshold of misconduct. Policy in this context means what could be done, not what should have been. In the months following the conviction, no legislative action was taken in Florida to amend domestic call response procedures. No proposals were introduced to mandate third-party welfare checks after multiple domestic call-outs within a single day. No state-level reforms were triggered. The Florida legislature held no hearings. The Navy issued no public statement beyond confirming Breanne Turner's administrative separation from military service following conviction. This case didn't spark national debate. It didn't trend. There was no podcast series, no TV dramatization. It didn't need those things to be real. Its legacy is not public. It's procedural. It lives in the system's silence, in how domestic cases are still classified as verbal only until blood proves otherwise, in how custody rulings, protective orders, and psychological evaluations still rely heavily on visible evidence of harm, in how search histories, warning signs, and low-grade coercion are rarely enough on their own to alter intervention. The case was, in many ways, textbook, and that's the issue. Colin Turner had no criminal record, no formal accusations, no documented outbursts, but he died in his garage, shot 4 times in the back while calling for help. His body was found within arm's reach of the phone. He used to say, clearly and audibly, "She just shot me." Breanne Turner had no prior convictions, no violent past. She held rank in the U.S. Navy, passed every background check, held security clearance, and was trained in de-escalation. But she locked her husband in a garage, waited, then shot him at close range. Neither of them was invisible, but the warning signs between them were too quiet to compete with the noise of functioning routines, military respectability, and legal ambiguity. When verdicts are issued, justice is measured by statute. When lives are lost, the weight is different. The Turner case leaves no catharsis, only a record, a verdict, a sentence, a redistribution of children across state lines. No law changed because of it. No prevention protocol was born out of its details. But the details matter. In towns like Gulf Breeze, crime doesn't always show up wearing a ski mask or breaking down doors. Sometimes it comes with a badge, or a uniform, or a marriage certificate. And when the system is calibrated to act only after violence occurs, the best anyone can hope for is that someone survives long enough to be believed. Colin Turner didn't. He reported. He called. He stayed. He died. And in the months that followed, the world moved on. But the data stayed. It's still there, in case files and body cam footage, in untouched Florida statutes. It speaks only to those willing to examine it for what it says. That law can record a murder, but it cannot always predict one. I'm sharing this story not because I want sympathy, but because I want someone out there to listen before it's too late for them to. If you ever feel like something's wrong in your home, trust that instinct. Don't wait for permission to speak. Don't assume the silence means safety. I learned, tragically, that the signs of danger aren't always loud. Sometimes they're measured in control, not bruises. And by the time help arrives, the damage is done. What do you think? Do our systems respond fast enough? Have you or someone you know ever faced a moment where you felt invisible inside your own home? If this story moved you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from or why this story stuck with you. If it didn't resonate, I still want to hear why. We're building a space where real stories create real awareness. And if you'd like to hear more stories that speak hard truths and ask harder questions, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next.